All right, folks, now we're getting into the meat and the potatoes of the political system called democracy here in Canada, specifically here in Alberta. And then we will look at conditions of democracy, what needs to exist, and what we see in the modern democratic system today. And then we will get to flaws of democracy. We're going to do this in two parts. The first part is going to be looking at what has to be present for a nation to be considered democratic, and then we will introduce some issues around democracy. And then in the second half of this, we're going to take a fair bit of time and talk about the political activity of lobbying, and in particular, something known as the Citizens United case and the ramifications of that particular decision in the United States of America. And then we'll talk about how the same thing is starting to happen here in Canada as well. All right, so buckle up, Buttercup. Let's get at it here. So conditions and flaws of democracy. So what the heck is democracy? So we've talked about it before. I'm a big fan of democracy. I like having some say in what my government does. I like choosing the leaders that I will have leading me personally. And when we think of democracy, I want you to think of the idea that it is, at its most basic, majority rule, right? When you think of democracy as far back as like ancient Athens, right? The city-state of Athens, it was quite literally majority rule, right? Now, guys, just so you know, I mean, in a real democracy, you can actually vote for some very terrible things, right? Like if we were a true democracy and we were sitting in class together, right? And someone said, I believe that we should exterminate red-haired gingery people because they have no souls, which of course isn't true, but nonetheless, some people believe that. And if we all put up our hands and supported that motion and said, yes, we should exterminate ginger people, in a class of 30, if 16 people put their hands up, that is a majority, and that is what you do. Now, in the modern ideal of democracy, it's not like they did that back in ancient Athens. I'm just saying democracy has its limits. Okay, now, guys, today, here in Canada, in the United States, in Germany, in Great Britain, and any nation that is considered to be an actual democracy, it is majority rule, just like it was back in its original inception many, many years ago in Athens, Greece. But we also, here in Canada, the US, etc., we also have provisions in our nations to ensure that the rights of the minority are also protected. So here in Canada, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that's what CCRF is talking about, right? The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects the rights of people who are not part of the majority, right? It protects the rights of all people. We can't just deny people rights that we think should be voted away because those things are enshrined, right? In the US, you have the Bill of Rights, which guarantees certain rights to people as well. So just make sure, guys, that despite the fact, or you understand that despite the fact that, democracy we think of as majority rule, that does not mean that it can be a majority tyranny. There's still rights and freedoms that are guaranteed to people who are not part of that voting majority. Now, continuing with the democratic system, there's also free and open competition for power. So in the democratic system, let's say you're not happy with the way things are going in your nation. Well, guess what? If you want, you can start your own political party. You have the right to do that. You can also choose to vote who you want to vote for, right? There's no bribery, ideally, right? There's no pressure, right? It's all about you choosing how you want it to play out. So there's free and open competition for power. And then lastly, guys, in the modern democratic system, as it should have been back in the day as well, there's this idea called responsible government, which is very, very important. It is a fundamental tenet of democracy here in Canada. It's the idea that those who we vote into power are accountable to us, the people, right? The will of the people needs to be what government does. And I'm going to say that term over and over again in this presentation. The idea of the will of the people is the essence of democracy. What we want, what our will is, should be what they do. Now, when we get to the second part and we talk about the power of corporate lobbying, you will see how, in fact, today in the modern democratic system, as or since the Citizens United case, the idea of will of the people, it really doesn't matter anymore. And I shouldn't be laughing about that, but I just can't believe that in the year 2020, things are only getting worse. Give you another example, guys, of accountability. So here in Alberta, the former premier, Alison Redford, right? She used the government of Canada she used a government of Alberta jet to fly her and her daughters down to Los Angeles, California to go shopping. And that was on the taxpayer dime, right? That was on the taxpayer dime. And when people found out about it and it was reported in the news, because one of the major functions of a democracy is to have a free media, right? One of the major aspects of it is to have a free media. When people found out about that, the electorate of Alberta was not happy. And what happened is we held the Conservative Party here in Alberta, we held it accountable. We held it responsible. And I think a lot of when Rachel Notley and the NDP got voted in can be explained by just the lack of accountability that we saw here in Alberta due to, up to that point, it was about 45 years of conservative government. They got to believe a little bit too much in their own grandness. And once she used that jet set from Alberta to California and back, people were not very happy about it. Okay, let's keep moving here. Now, some conditions for democracy. So guys, number one, it says rule by the majority of people. We know this, right? Democracy is majority rule. And in order to be a democracy, there's a number of things that have to be present that we expect to see in democratic systems today. So number one, we have to have periodic elections. When I think of an election, guys, in a democratic system, I think of just, I don't know if you've ever done this or not, but I remember, when the same government's in power for a long time, it tends to get stinky. It tends to get corrupted. So I'll give you an example, right? And this is just a metaphor, but I'm looking out into my backyard right now and I think I am the person who laid that sod down back there. And it was a hot, hot summer day. And as the south sun beat down on me and I had just dirt covering every inch of my body, right? Where there was not a shirt or shorts, there was just dirt covering me. Because when you lay sod down, it goes on top of dirt. And at the end of the day, I remember coming inside my house here and going for a shower and just seeing the dirt running off me and the water at the bottom of the shower just being black from the dirt that was washing off me. That's kind of like what an election does, right? An election, guys, is the refreshing of the political landscape in a democracy. So there must be elections that happen periodically. So when you think of the old Soviet Union, right, they came into power, the Bolsheviks, in 1917, and then finally in 1991, as you know, that all collapsed, right? There was no accountability. There were no elections. Elections hold political leaders accountable. And if they do a good job, they get to keep their job. And if they don't, it's peace, hit the bricks, and you are done. So here in Canada, guys, at the federal level, in our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it specifically mentions somewhere in like the high 30s of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? It's not the beginning, it's somewhere near the end. It mentions that no parliament shall sit for a duration of longer than 5 years. And why? Again, prevent tyranny, prevent stagnation, prevent complacency in rule. All very important. So in the US, guys, governments, presidential candidates, right? People who are the president can only remain in power every they remain in power like for 4 years, right? It is a scheduled election. The first Tuesday of November every 4th year, you have an American federal election, right? So that's federally Canada and the US. Here in Alberta, right, no parliaments can sit for longer than 4 years. So every 4 years, we have to have a provincial election. Now, elections can happen sooner than that here in Canada or in Alberta, right? Not in the US, though. Presidential elections are scheduled. When they get voted in, they get a term of 4 years. But guys, here in Alberta or in Canada at the federal level, if governments want, they can call an election. And the only reason they do that is because they're polling high, right? They're doing well in election polls, and they think they're going to get more seats, more control in government. And if they're not polling well, they are not having an election anytime soon, right? They're going to try to do damage control and fix things. Now, the next condition we need to see for democracy is the idea of secret ballots. Why? We want to make sure that who you vote for, who I vote for, is not because of intimidation or bribery, right? When we did student vote last year at ABJ, we had like those dividers up, right? You walked in, you got the divider around you, and then you cast your ballot, you folded it, and you put it in the ballot box, right? And that's because your vote is your secret, right? We want to make sure that the outcome of an election is as impartial as possible. And secret ballots help facilitate that impartial nature of democratic elections. All right, next, universal suffrage. We've talked about the idea of suffrage before. And guys, in any democracy, there should be as few impediments as possible to having people vote, right? And guys, when Canada originally became a nation, right, July 1st, 1867, very few people were actually allowed to vote, right? You had to be a male, so sorry ladies, right? You're just not included. So you had to be a male, you had to be 21 years of age, and you had to be a British citizen, right? If you weren't those three things, you didn't get to vote. And only, I believe it was 11 or 12% of the actual Canadian population at that time fell into that category. So, 11 or 12% of Canada's population had the ability to dictate what happened for the other 88 or 89% of the population. Doesn't sound like a good idea. Also, guys, with universal suffrage, right, everyone has the right to vote, or they have the franchise, as it's sometimes called. Make sure you know that term. And all people are also allowed to run for office. We talked about that, right? If you're not happy with the political system, you can start your own political party. And to be honest, Mr. Jolly and myself have talked about this because it just seems to be the same old same. You got the crazy left, you got the crazy right, and there's no sensible moderate party anymore. So who knows? Who knows what the future will hold? Okay, fourth condition for democracy is an independent judiciary. So it says the court system and judges are beyond the control of government as they are often called upon to make decisions that go against the government. And again, guys, when we talked about separation of powers, Montesquieu, all that stuff, I said to you very clearly, the most important part of Montesquieu's separation of powers is an independent judiciary. Nations that don't have independent court systems are nations like China, North Korea, Syria, former Nazi Germany, the former USSR, where simply the court system is an extension of the ruling class, the ruling party, and we don't want that, right? And of course, guys, this helps establish the rule of law, and you should be familiar with that idea. And I said this before, and I'll say it again. Without rule of law, you have nothing. There is no security in a nation that does not observe the rule of law. All right, you must also have political parties, plural, many, as many as possible, right? We want to make sure that the diverse opinions of the electorate, right, of the people, are being represented. So case in point, guys, when you think about American politics, there's generally two choices in the US, right? There is the Democrats and the Republicans. And when you actually look at there's like indexes of quality of democracy that are published every year, and nations like Canada, where we have, I would argue, at least three solid political parties for people to choose from, right? The Conservatives, the Liberals, and the NDP, right? Where you have more political parties and people have more choice, it says something about the health of that democracy. So the US actually scores lower in scores of their democratic health compared to Canada because of the fact that there are less political parties for people to choose from, right? There's just not a viable third option. So political parties, really simple, just a collection of like-minded people, right? And this provides people with choice, right? That's all that we want. And again, if you're not happy with the choices that you get, then you can start your own political party. And who knows, maybe you will be one of the individuals who helps bring massive electoral change to Alberta, right? Or even Canada, who knows? All right. And you must also have a free press. What is this? Condition number 6, 5? I don't know. Free press. Guys, the role of the media or the press in a democracy is to be a watchdog, to hold people in power accountable, to ask the tough questions. Actually, it was funny. I was on Twitter earlier and there was a reporter from Calgary who today phoned in and was asking our premier about whether or not we should be having a discussion about a Green New Deal. I don't know if you guys remember when we talked about this or looked at this in class already, but basically the Green New Deal started off in the United States of America, and it's the plan is to transition America away as quickly as possible from a fossil fuel carbon-based economy. And some people say it is a pie in the sky idea. That's exactly what Premier Kenney said today. Alternatively though, guys, you know what? I applauded that individual who asked that question today because he asked a difficult question that needs to be considered by our government. Now, one big issue with modern democracy and modern society is the fact that more and more media is being bought up by fewer and fewer individuals. In grade 10 social, you should have learned about this idea of centralization or concentration of media. And as fewer own more, are we really getting the truth? Are we getting some version of propaganda that they want us to believe in? Shout out to Noam Chomsky, by the way, who talks about the role of media is to really just manufacture consent, right? That's what Noam Chomsky says about modern media today. There is no diversity of opinion because if they ask tough questions, they'll be shut out from press conferences or future questioning periods, and then that will be detrimental to their news organization. All right, now, how democracies work. So guys, back in the day, when we think of ancient Athens, they used a form of democracy called direct democracy. And we'll talk about its alternative called representative democracy in a second. So a direct democracy, guys, typically when we think direct democracy, we see it play out in one of two ways here in the modern world. We see referendums or we see plebiscites, and they essentially mean the same thing. A referendum or a plebiscite is when government asks its constituents directly to vote on an issue, on a question. And probably the most significant referendum we had here in Canada happened in 1995 or 6 when Quebec was talking about separating from Canada. The Quebec government asked the people of Quebec, do you want to leave Canada? And basically the outcome of that vote would have determined whether Quebec stayed with Canada or not. And the outcome of that vote was 49.9% of Quebecers said, yes, we want to leave. And 50.1% of Quebecers said, no, we want to stay. More recently, of course, Brexit, right? Brexit is an example of direct democracy, right? The people of the United Kingdom voted on leaving the European Union, and the vote, right? The outcome of the vote, more people voted yes, we want to leave, then no, we want to stay. And I believe, I'm positive that as of right now, the United Kingdom is taking steps to break its economic and political ties with the European Union. Now, generally, we don't use direct democracy in nations anymore. Why? Well, there's two reasons. Nations are big and they have lots of people. And because of that, it would be impractical to use direct democracy all the time. So instead, what happens, guys, is we use something called representative democracy, where we vote for people to represent us, known as constituents, in either the provincial or federal government. We'll talk about the federal government right now. So at the federal level, guys, the map of Canada, right? Canada right there on the screen, is divided into 338 constituencies, ridings, or electoral districts. They all mean the same thing, right? They all mean the same thing. And guys, constituencies, what happens is the job of the member of parliament who gets voted in that constituency is to represent us in Ottawa, right? They spend some time here, they meet with people, they take phone calls, they hug babies, whatever it happens to be, although we're not going to be hugging anytime soon. But anyways, with that, they then, spend some time here, and then they go to Ottawa and they represent what we want, right? The majority of people want here in Alberta, based on what we tell them. Phone calls, in-office visits, emails, letters, whatever it happens to be, right? So representative democracy is the order of the day, right? And technically speaking, each member of parliament represents, it's about 500,000 people, right? If you take Canada's population of 38 million people, divide it by 338, right? You can do the math on that. Now, it's very hard to represent that many people, but nonetheless, that is their job. All right, now, problems with democracy. Problem number one. So guys, now that we're done talking about what democracy is, let's talk about some problems that we see in the modern democratic system. And probably the biggest problem that we see, folks, is this thing called voter apathy. When you're apathetic about something, you're like, "Meh," right? That's my impression of an apathetic person, right? When someone asks you a question to have an opinion about something, you're just like, "Meh, I don't care." Right? That's my apathetic impression. Pretty solid, right? So anyways, I want you guys to understand this. Apathy is cancer for democracy. If you don't care about democracy, I guarantee you there's someone who will try to minimize your vote as quickly as they can. So it says there are many reasons why voters don't participate in elections, right? Lack of understanding of the issue. Maybe they can't get there on the day of the election. They don't have a car and the polling station's not convenient to get to. Maybe they don't speak English or French. Lack of resources like poverty. You don't own a car. There's a number of reasons. But guys, I want you to consider that when the time comes for you to vote, whether it is municipal, provincial, or federal, I want you to do it. People have bled and died for your right to cast a ballot, to have some say in our government. Now, on the next slide, it is a little political cartoon about a tribute to the Canadian voter. And I just want to actually bring up a different sheet here. Let me just pop that on here. Okay, so guys, in this sheet here, it shows the voter turnout in Canadian federal elections since 1972. Canadians for a long time were always, 80 to 75% as far as the participation in federal elections. And as time has gone on, we have seen that dip down. That is what voter apathy looks like. And the question is, maybe we need mandatory voting here in Canada, right? Maybe we don't. I don't know. But at some point, guys, what happens if less than 1 out of 2 eligible voters actually goes out to cast their ballot? How legitimate would our democracy be if the majority of people actually chose to not vote, right? Think about that for a sec. Now, bottom of this, right? The red line is Canada and the blue line is the United States. And what we can see, guys, is, back in the day, Canadians voted at a much higher percentage as far as turnout in federal elections. And now we have basically converged with the United States of America, right? We have become just like the US when it comes to our apathy towards politics. And I don't get it, man. I love voting. Even if I'm not happy with the choices, I will still do it. Now, maybe that's because at my polling station, which is SCA down from me here in Foxborough, maybe it's because at my polling station, they usually have cookies and juice. Now, look, even if they didn't have cookies and juice to entice me to come vote, I would still do it because in my heart of hearts, I believe that voting is important. It is critical to our democracy. And like I said, apathy when it comes to voting is cancer for democracy. So if you click this link, right, it takes you to a website that demonstrates, I'll just really quickly do it here. Allow. There we go. So on this site, once it loads my internet, there we go. You can see, right, voter turnout of every single Canadian election that we've ever had in history. And if you look at it, right, 73%, 70, blah, 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 70s, 60s, you know, high 70s, and high 70s, mid 70s. But look at now. Right, we've actually had Canadian elections where our turnout rate has been in the 50% range, 58.8%, 61, 68. Guys, get out there and vote, ladies and gentlemen. It's so important. So this is a former diploma source actually getting at the idea of voter apathy and how bad it is. And guys, look, if you don't vote and you do nothing to participate in our democracy, don't complain. Right? Because complaining about our democracy when you do nothing to change it makes you into a hypocrite. And don't be a hypocrite, right? I vote mainly because I want to be able to bitch about the government, right? I want to be able to complain about it. And that's exactly what this cartoon is getting at. So we have this happy guy here casting his ballot in the ballot box. And then he's got this big button on. And this guy says, what does that button on your shirt say? And it says, now I have the right to complain. Look, guys, this is getting at the idea that if you do nothing to change the course of our political system, then don't whine when it doesn't go how you want, right? You are a hypocrite. All right. Now, really quickly, last couple of slides here. Some other problems with democracy, tyranny of the majority. Thankfully, guys, this isn't that big of an issue here in Canada because we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the American Bill of Rights in the US, right? In the UK, they have a constitution. In Germany, France, right? We always have protection of minority people, which is good. Now, another issue that we have with democracy is this idea of party discipline. So let me explain this. So party discipline, guys, is this convention amongst people that belong to a political party. Let's say the Liberal Party of Canada, right? Let's say the Liberals were going to vote in a bill and make it a law that looked to reduce greenhouse gas emissions here in Canada, right? But you're a Liberal MP from Alberta, and here in Alberta, you know that your constituents do not want that to happen because let's face it, here in Alberta, our lifeblood is oil, and a reduction in greenhouse gases will mean death for the economy of Alberta. So you have a choice at that point. Do you do what your party says? Or do you vote the way you know your constituents want? And unfortunately, guys, usually the answer is I do what my party tells me to do. Now, why is that? Well, the reason for that is because if you don't vote along, quote, party lines, you will be removed from your party. You will be told to leave the party, right? You'll be dismissed. So unfortunately, guys, the wishes of voters sometimes get forgotten about when it comes to the way votes happen in the House of Commons, right? You go along party lines, and that's because of this convention called party discipline. The whole point is to avoid what are called no confidence votes, because if a major bill like a budget bill doesn't pass in the House of Commons, it means that the government has forfeited the will of the people, and then you have to have an election. So party discipline helps avoid elections that happen more regularly because, you know, you don't have governments topple, and it also helps the government in power appear as if it has solidarity amongst all of its people. All right, next problem with democracy. It says often in democracies, it's mainly the rich and educated who participate in politics As a result, this elite group tend to get what they want. They also have the ability to lobby government to get what they want. We'll talk about that more in the next one. And then lastly, guys, poor people, the people who most need help from government, tend to be disengaged from the political process. And that is an absolute shame, because issues of poverty need to be priority for government. Yet when people who can't vote or don't vote, right, whether it's because of, economic reasons, job reasons, whatever it happens to be, when their will is not cast, right, then government just doesn't care about what the needs of that particular group in society is. Okay, sorry guys, I am passionate about democracy. I'm looking down now and I see that this has been 30 minutes and 39 seconds. So peace. I love you guys. Hopefully you're like fired up about democracy and love it like I do. Check you guys later.